bardzo miło Państwa powitać na kolejnym spotkaniu z cyklu Hortus Deliciarum, tym razem organizowanego przez Pracownię Łaciny Średniowiecznej i przez Towarzystwo Miłośników Języka Polskiego. Dzisiaj naszym gościem jest pan Renaud Alexandre z jednostki czy Instytutu CNRS-u. Renaud zajmuje się, jest przede wszystkim leksykografem i jednym z autorów nowym dossier Latinitatis, słownika łaciny europejskiej, z którym to współpracujemy od lat przeszło 60. Renaud również specjalizuje się w średniowiecznej literaturze, przede wszystkim Półwyspu Iberyjskiego, we wczesnej literaturze Półwyspu Iberyjskiego. To nie jest temat najczęściej omawiany w polskim środowisku naukowym, stąd tym bardziej cieszymy się, że Renaud zgodził się przyjąć nasze zaproszenie. Renaud bardzo odważnie i to od lat 10 przynajmniej sięga po metody cyfrowe w swojej pracy. Najpierw współpracował z projektem Omnia, w ramach którego był jedną z ważniejszych osób odpowiedzialnych za lematyzację tekstów łaciny średniowiecznej, za organizację również całego workflow czy przebiegu, a także za zebranie wielkiego gigantycznego leksykonu, który służył następnie opowiadaniu tekstów łacińskich. Ostatnio również zajmuje się paleografią czy kodykologią cyfrową. Być może, jeżeli starczy nam czasu, będziemy mógł podzielić się naszymi badaniami, które prezentował na zeszłorocznej konferencji VIIth, gdzie prezentował metody statystyczne czy metody clusteringu, które pozwoliły mu na znalezienie wyjątkowo dużych rękopisów i na operacjonalizację czy na kwantyfikację pojęcia dużego rękopisu. Czym właściwie jest duży rękopis i co to znaczy duży rękopis? Nie zrozumiał z tego, o czym mówię, prawdopodobnie wiele. Merci de venir à Cracovie et je te laisse la parole.
Merci. Alors tout d'abord, quelques mots en français. Première chose, donc merci à Krzysztof pour cette présentation dont j'ai saisi quelques mots ici et là. Et merci aussi et surtout pour cette invitation à parler à Cracovie, qui est une ville où j'apprécie beaucoup de venir et de travailler avec vous, ce qui est le cas depuis maintenant un certain nombre d'années. Alors, un jour, peut-être, j'espère, mon niveau de polonais me permettra de venir faire une conférence ici en polonais. J'aimerais bien, vraiment. Cela dit, si je m'y prends assez tôt la prochaine fois, je le fais en français, tu traduis et je parle. Malheureusement, ce n'est pas encore le cas, et donc du coup, pour la présentation que je vais faire, je vais maintenant passer à l'anglais. So, today I will talk about a group of manuscripts and texts that scholars have called the hagiographical compilation of Valerius of Bierzo. In this very first sentence I just said, every word is a problem. Scholars talk about this hagiographical compilation without having been able so far to define with certainty its very perimeter, which texts belong to it, which do not. In addition, the list of relevant manuscripts is not, in my opinion, closed. There are some manuscripts we know belong to this compilation, but some are at the border or are not known yet. And Valerius himself is a problem for reasons I will examine in a few moments. Moreover, as he is less known than Cicero or Augustine, it may be useful to give some biographical details. So, for clarity's sake, I will then begin with some elements on Valerius's life and works before I come to the dossier called the hagiographical compilation. So first, Valerius. Valerius of Bierzo is an unusual character. He was an hermit who lived during the 7th century in the northwest of the Iberian Peninsula in the diocese of Astorga. So here you see in the map, you have the borders which correspond to the Roman provinces, and the episcopal sees are indicated, and in the northwest you see Asturica, which is the modern Astorga, And so this is the province he declares in the beginning of his autobiography, Asturiensis provinciae indigena, to have to come. Alors, donc, escape. So, in the Diocese of Astorga, as you can see, he writes himself in the beginning of the Ordo Querimonie, and more precisely, in the region of Bierzo, a region full of mountains, who attracted people willing to withdraw from the saeculum, the secular world, in such a way that scholars, for many decades now, have been talking of a Thebaid in Bierzo on the model of the Egyptian deserts, which is an important theme as far as Valerius is concerned. The dates and chronology of Valerius' life are approximate, mainly because the only testimonies we have about his life come from his own works. But we can more or less safely say that he was born around 6025 and died around 6095. If we try to interpret with caution what he wrote, and the last biographical attempt has been made by José Carlos Martín, which I quote here, we can trace back some steps in his life. First, the feeling which Valerius confesses of having been called to a monastic life, followed by a trip toward the monastery of Complutum, founded some decades before by Fructuosus of Braga, which monastery which he may never have reached. The texts are ambiguous on that matter. Then a stay as an hermit, sometimes alone and sometimes with pupils entrusted to him by their parents from the neighborhood, and sometimes with a disciple, in a place called Castropedroso. And at that time appeared the first conflicts with a priest of a church nearby, Flinus, called by Valerius slave of the devil. After having been attacked in Castropedroso by thieves, Valerius is received by a noble Goth called Ricimer on his estate at Ebronanto. So on the slide you have the approximate dates. Ricimer takes Valerius on his estate, but compelled by the devil, as Valerius writes, he wants to build a church on his estate and to make Valerius priest, servant of this church. Valerius, as an hermit, never wanted to become priest, and so, fortunately, as Valerius writes, Ricimer dies before he could complete this project. And finally, after 20 years of a life partially cenobitic and partially anachoretic, Valerius joins the community of Rufiana that became later on, according to scholars, the monastery of San Pedro de Montes, of which you have a photograph here. In this place, this is where he may have written the major part of the texts that we have today. Last episode of his life, as he narrates it, that may be interesting for our presentation. While he was in Rufiana, the Bishop of Astorga, Isidore, asks him to accompany him to a council, maybe to ask against him disciplinary penalty, or to address his case with the assembly gathered then. Valerius refuses sharply, and fortunately, once again, as Valerius writes it, Isidore dies. Well, as for the life, this is what we can get as a first sketch. Valerius wrote some poems and treatises, but if he is known above all, this is for two reasons. First, because of the texts he wrote partially or totally in the first person, which is quite rare for the time, and second, because of a collection of ascetic and hagiographical texts that he compiled, of which we will speak later. These two elements are closely linked together, his text and the compilation. We will see it in detail later on, but we will begin to describe some of the first-person texts who will constitute a good introduction to the character and to the issues the compilation raises. These texts, written in the first person, are of two kinds. On the one hand, there are narratives of visions of the afterlife, which Valerius gathered from the visionaries themselves, and which he introduces. Those are the visions of Maximus, transmitted under a title that was certainly meant to englobe the whole collection, Dicta Beati Valerii ad Beatum Donadeum, Maximus then, Bonellus, and Baldarius. So, Dicta for Maximus, De Bonello Monaco for Bonellus, and De Celeste Revelatione for Baldarius. On the other hand, and I will spend more time with those texts written in the first person, whose main character is no other than Valerius himself. These last three texts bear the following titles: Ordo Querimoniae, which we can translate like list of my complaints, Replicatio Sermonum a prima conversione, so once again my discourse about what I did after I changed, and Quod de superioribus querimoniis residuum sequitur, what I forgot in the first two texts and I had now. And those texts are transmitted by respectively 4, 2, and 1 manuscripts. Those texts are currently being edited by a French and Spanish team and may be published this year. The last edition was that of Manuel Cecilio Diaz, who appeared in 2006. They have probably been written in this order. So first the Ordo, then the Replicatio, and after that the text which we called Residuum. As far as we know for the moment, those texts are considered to lie outside the compilation, but they are of interest to us for two reasons that bind clearly the Valerian text to the project of the compilation. First, the reasons pushed forward by Valerius as causes for his writing, and second, the weak frontier between biography, autobiography, which is a word that I reject, and we will see why later on, and hagiography. As you may have felt during the sketch I briefly drew earlier of Valerius, for today's reader, reading those texts is a strange experience. The fight against the devil is violent and pervades quite all the moments of the narrative under different forms. The demon can attack Valerius directly, as we can see in this text, which I translate briefly. While I was praying or while I was lying down, being seated at my head, the devil sent to me a scent horrible in order to make me feel bad. Let's say it this way. So in this example, or through the means of possessed men. So the devil attacked Valerius personally, or he possessed men. The first one was Flainus, donc quidam vir barbarus Flainus nomine antiqui hostis stimulis instigatus in vidie facibus subcensus cepit adversus pusilitatem meam odia machinare. So a barbarous man named Flainus, compelled by the stimulus of the old enemy and inflamed by the invidia, and I will come back to invidia later, and blinded by the blackness of this invidia, became mad and began to make plans and hating plans against me. Second person Ricimer, Servissimus adversarius, so adversarius is as hostis the devil. Servissimus adversarius adversus est in lustrem virum ricimirum, and the third one, Isidore. And once again, with the same words, Valerius says that the devil takes the place, or pushes forward and takes the place of the man he possesses in order to attack Valerius. So, once again, the demon can attack Valerius directly or through the means of possessed men who act as the devil's agents, whether they are possessed permanently, as for example in the case of Linus, more or less, if they are bad men, and in that case their demonic nature appears clearly from their physical description. For example, Linus is clearly black, or more temporarily. In addition, as it was frequent in late antique polemics, the opponent was accused of being insane, in order to be disqualified. And in Valerius's text, we see one here, but we count frequent mentions of Vesania, Insania, and in our text. So, the addition of these two items, violence and accusation of madness, have had great influence on the modern reception of Valerius's texts, and even benevolent scholars like Manuel Cecilio Diaz, who spent a good part of his scholarly life on Valerius, considered that he was suffering from, in the strong meaning of the expression, persecution mania, and that his work, and here more precisely the fact of having entitled one work Ordo Querimoniae, list of my complaints, he was to him a proof of cerramiento espiritual, spiritual imprisonment. But such a judgment is a problem. First, it's impossible to prove it, and once it has been cast, difficult to be discarded completely, and it gives an easy explanation that prevents any effort of real understanding. Here we deal with a problem that goes clearly much beyond Valerius, and of which our hermit is simply an excessive expression. That is, before we draw any conclusion on mentalities of people from the antiquity, the Middle Ages, and the modern ages, it seems reasonable to consider, as long as possible, that antique, late antique, and medieval mentalities were completely different from ours, and to draw the list of similarity between them and us only when we see clearly how much different they were. Valerius's text is clearly full of traps for a contemporary mind. Its aggressiveness and the permanent use of madness, very unusual for French people, and maybe a little bit less if we consider, for example, American political rhetoric, makes it, at least for French people, very difficult to analyze them from a neutral point of view. Moreover, in those texts, Valerius differs from a literary tradition. He clearly inserts his text in an hagiographical tradition, but he is at the same time the author and the main character, which is quite unusual even in modern and contemporary times as far as sainthood is concerned. Generally, the life of a saint, of someone who could be saint, is written by someone else. For this reason, scholars prefer now to put these texts under a category called auto-hagiography, and to approach them with much caution. On this very question, the most clarifying texts I've read has been written by Roger Collins in 1986, and I will simply quote him now. The apparently autobiographical character of Valerius's work only serves to make it more disconcerting to the modern reader, who expects, or of which we suppose that he expects, to share a common thought world with his author. To read, for example, and here I make a parenthesis, the hermit Arsenius is quoted in the third text of Valerius. In the Residuum, Valerius talks about Arsenius. So to read Arsenius throwing stones at unwanted visitors may seem quaint or amusing, but a similar attitude in Valerius' first-person narration is the more violent and threatening, for being presented in a one-to-one relationship with the reader, who is thus denied his normal role of detached observer of events described in the third person. In modern judgments on Valerius, and this is Collins' conclusion, the mask has been mistaken for the man, and if we do not analyze Valerius from a rhetorical point of view, we lose everything. In short, Valerius wasn't mad, or if he was, to say it is clearly beyond our reach. What is much more interesting to us is that he had a precise project, of which the autohagiographical texts are one expression. If he depicts himself as a follower of the saints, and I give only here 2 examples, the 20 years of eremitic life that we can see here between Castro Pedroso and Ebronanto, so before reaching Rufiana, these 20 years correspond exactly to the figure given for Saint Anthony, which make it difficult to interpret this figure as purely descriptive. First, and in the, if I remember well, Ordo Querimoniae, his destruction of pagan altars in the neighborhood is meant to follow Saint Martin. So, if he depicts himself as a follower of the saints, it is to build a contemporary model for his fellow monks. So, this is his project, but the exact expression of this project is displayed in different places. The main one is situated at the end of the first-person text, the Ordo Querimoniae. So you have it on the screen. I translate it quickly. If I compiled the numerous fights and difficulties I met and gave them to an audience, prolata, it was not because, blinded by temerity, I loved the vainglory, but it was in order to put clearly under the eyes of those who have the desire to turn themselves towards the Lord, having made professions of monks, how pernicious are the difficulties pushed on the way by the enemy, full of envy, who pursues them, and how cruel is the manifold perversity of envying men, envy once more, and how men who have the desire of obtaining the palm of victory have to fight without restraint. Thus, the exhausting combat will not provoke exhaustion and despair, but the fear of God and His judgment, coupled with the hope in eternal life, will continuously strengthen them until the end. This text is particularly interesting in many regards. Valerius describes at the same time the audience he aims at, so you see it in bold here, ut cunctis pactesceret qui desiderant ad dominum convertere and qui desiderat palmifera obtinere victoriam, and the function he gives this text, and his conception of monastic life, described as a struggle against the devil and the men that serve him, with obstacula inimici invidentis, certamine agonis. To complete this quick survey of Valerius' life and personal work, I will just briefly insist on one word I first spotted, invidia. Because if the main function of the text is to prepare Valerius' readers against the difficulties of life, those difficulties come from the outside and are caused by invidia. The devil, as well as bad men, are described as invidentes, as we can see here. But this invidia, hatred of the devil towards men, and so coming from the devil and circulating among men, is mentioned in a certain number of texts not written by Valerius and present in manuscript bearing his hagiographical compilation, the Vita Nauki. Nothing is ever sure with the devil, and even when I was hidden, invidia found me. etc., etc. So ours are tortured by invidia for the Vita Antoni. Shut up, devil, because this is not Ambrosius who tortures you, but the faith of the saints and your invidia for the Vita Ambrosi, and the Vita Fructuosi, which probably hasn't been written by Valerius, but in a circle close to Valerius, uses quite the same words as Valerius. And so in the first example, a man is pushed by the devil to take Fructuosus' sister's estate, and in the second, that's the same thing. A man kills a beast, and he is invidiae ignis sucensus, so inflamed by the fire of envy. So now that we see more clearly who Valerius is and for whom and why he wrote his own texts, let us come to the main question: what is the hagiographical compilation? Unfortunately, this is a very good question. Let's begin by saying that it is a collection of texts whose gathering is credited to Valerius. These texts belong, for some of them, to the ascetic tradition, Latin translations of the De Reparatione Lapsi of Chrysostomus, of the Historia Monacorum, of the Life of Anthony, Lives of Monks by Jerome, etc. And some of them are saints' lives, more or less outside this ascetic tradition. For example, the life of Augustine, the life of German, Bishop of Auxerre, etc., etc. The grouping of those texts is preserved in 10 manuscripts or so, but the oldest manuscripts dates back to 902, so 2 centuries after Valerius' death. And even if some manuscripts are close in content, there is not a pair of manuscripts containing exactly the same text in the same order. With time, texts have been withdrawn, others have been added, folia have disappeared, etc., etc. The main reason why we believe this grouping has been consciously built up by a man called Valerius is the presence in the oldest manuscript of 2 acrostic and telestic poems entitled, for the first one, Epitameron de Libri Huius Exordio, so Epitameron on the beginning of this book, and for the other, Epitameron Consumationis Libri Huius, Epitameron on the end of this book. The first one is preserved in a poor state of conservation in only 1 manuscript, and the other one, probably saved by his position in the text, in 5 manuscripts. I will not insist here on the quite strange word epitameron. I will just say that it derives from the Greek word eptametron and is used by Valerius only to name his poems, whichever their number of verse or type of metric, as far as we know. That epitameron means poem. But those epitameron create a collection effect, clearly a wanted collection effect, and the acrostic and telestic items give an idea of the destinataries. The first one is much damaged, but Diaz's edition allows us to spot some key features that give an idea of the original content. The metaphor used, very traditional, are those of a walk, as you can see here, if I found the mouse, in the, as you can see here with Gressos vitae nostrae, so those of a walk on the path, tramite, the life conceived as sailing on a sea full of tempests, so procelosum undani maris et tranquillum vitae portum. All those elements describe the difficulties of life, and particularly those of the monastic propositum in a world filled with people with foul intentions, ruled by the devil. It is necessary to stick physically to the example left by saints. And that's the same thing with the Epitameron Consumationis, which begins with edificatione morum atque correctione animarum. So the aim of the text is to instruct the monks. So, in short, well, I will skip to go quicker one slide about the reading of those texts in monastic rules. But in Valerius's day, the Cenobites were definitely invited to read the Bible and the lives of the fathers, hence the need to collect those texts. The monastic world changed throughout the Middle Ages, and the motivation that led to the copying of the compilation may have changed too. This will be in the times to come one of my concerns, but I will leave it aside for the moment and will only present briefly the manuscripts. Even if we have no certainty of the matter that the collection of Valerius did not pass the border of the peninsula, we can suppose that its success was far from being ridiculous, as we can see from the 10 or so preserved manuscripts. So the first, I display only 8. The first one I hear from the oldest to the newest. So the first one is of the 10th century. The first two are of the 10th century. The 2 seconds are from the 11th. And then we have the second phase of copy with 12th and 13th centuries. And in the end, the last one and the quite last discovered from Salamanca, which is of the 14th century. The first one, Biblioteca Nacional de España 10,007, is the only one that contains both Epitameron, and one could conclude that from that fact that this manuscript is a faithful reflection of the original compilation. Some scholars have defended this point of view during the 20th century. And one of the main arguments in favor of this reliability of the manuscript are Roman numbers. We find indeed in the margin of some texts Roman numbers, and Manuel Cecilio Diaz, who was the first one to try to interpret it, saw in these numbers a trace of a numbering that could date back to Valerius. He even tried using the few numbers left, 9, 11, 15, 16, 24, 27, 32, 36, 39, 40, 41, 40, 48 twice, that's a problem, and 49, to rebuild the original physiognomy of the compilation. It was quite convincing, but faces some major difficulties. The first one is that we have no other example of a mix of previous texts and personal or contemporary texts before the 10th century. This is the first objection. But this reason is clearly not sufficient. In other fields, precursors do exist. But the second difficulty, much more serious, has been developed by, once again, Roger Collins in the article I already mentioned. The text of the Dicta Beati Valeri, written by Valerius and inserted between the both Epitamera in our manuscript of Madrid, begin with the words et ut deis duabus retributionibus se pedictis manifestius pateat, in order to make clear what concerns these two rewards mentioned above. This beginning indicates that the preceding texts talks about two rewards, but there is no such concern in the text that precedes the dicta in our Madrid manuscripts, because this text is the Epistle of Egeria and doesn't talk about rewards. However, this text, in the reconstruction of Diaz, disappeared from the compilation, so we can go back once more, but the text, the previous one, isn't relevant either. So the text that seems to be relevant, and Manuel Diaz in his last work on Valerius agreed with that, but without drawing the conclusion from it for the Roman numbers, is the De Vana Saeculi Sapientia, a treatise written by Valerius, whose last paragraphs deal with the distinction in the day of the last judgment between the Benedicti, at the right of God, and the Maledicti, to his left. And we find this very sequence of the De Vana Saeculi Sapientia and Dicta in two manuscripts. Madrid, the second here in this list, Madrid, Real Academia de la Historia 13th, and the collection of the two which are in the fourth possession, so Madrid 822 and Paris 2178. Therefore, either the Roman numbers date back to Valerius, and in that case we would have different recensions of the compilations where he would have changed the order for one of them, forgetting the reason of the ordering, or the Roman numbers have been added after Valerius, and in that case, how reliable is the manuscript bearing them for the reconstruction of the compilation? In short, it seems to me that if you want to reach a permanent result, it is necessary to start all over again, and to deal with this question with as few a priori as possible, which implies to draw a list of the manuscripts bearing the compilation, of the texts contained in those manuscripts, and to gather as much information as possible on the textual tradition of those texts. But this is which we reach the crux of the problem, and I hope I will have enough time to explain it. And the crux of the problem is that in the 19th and 20th century, classical philology's mission consisted in producing for every known text the most reliable state, that is to say, the state closest to what may have been written or dictated by the author himself. To that end, people searched for the manuscripts, examined them, selected those who seemed more useful to go back to the archetype, saw how they derive from one another, and rebuilt the text. So, in an ideal world, it would be sufficient to compile the information that critical editions of the text of the compilation contain, in order to be able to understand at what time those texts crossed the borders of the Iberian Peninsula and when they reached the compilation. But this is when it becomes complicated for many reasons. I will explain, giving a few examples. The first one is that critical editions may not have used manuscripts of the compilation. For example, the De Reparatione Lapsi is edited in the Source Chrétienne. It's a provisional edition and has used no manuscript of the compilation. The place of our manuscript in the stemma is unknown and no stemma has been made. Once more, Michele Pellegrino, editor of the Vita Ambrosii, has used only one manuscript of our compilations, and so on. And even when they used our manuscripts, their collation and conclusions may not be entirely reliable and directly usable. For example, I compared the collation made by the editor of the Vita Antoni on the manuscripts of Madrid, on the principal manuscripts, with my own collation. And in the text with 15,000 and more loci, that is to say, text sequences of one word when nothing happens and more when the manuscript tradition varies in that place, he has 1,100 and I spotted 1,700. Some difference do not matter or may not matter. For example, he sees no interest in giving the word form senes as a variant to senex, while I do, so this doesn't matter, I agree. But some do matter, as when, for example, in the prefatory letter to the text, he edits the text as such: et vos cum admiratione audientes scio eius propositum cupere sectari, without giving any variants, while we can read in our manuscript, as you can see, sancti eius prepositum. This kind of error is important for two reasons. So, is it clear? Is the difference clear or not? Yeah. This kind of error is important because it insists on a feature potentially common to texts of the Iberian Peninsula, whose Visigothic minuscule abbreviation system was quite different for per, pre, and pro. And in spite of all the respect I have for the work of this editor in particular, who dealt with a very long text with a lot of variability and contamination, and in addition try to trace back its history in text collection, and I owe a lot to him, one cannot prevent from asking himself how reliable is the rest of the edition and the conclusions as far as the textual tradition is concerned. And in addition, critical principles are not the same between two editions. Some editors try to keep as much information as possible in the apparatus, others don't. And this one quoted from the Vita Ambrosi of Pellegrinos shows that if he thinks that a variant is a mistake, he discards it. And so I can't use it unless I do his work once again. So, in addition, what I wish to do is to situate for every text the manuscripts of the compilation in a wider set of manuscripts. But it happens that the major parts of the text present in the compilation or nearby have been copied many, many times. I can give here some examples, but I want to remind beforehand that the database FAMA, that lists texts when they have been copied in a lot of manuscripts, gives the following definition for a lot: 30 copies for profane works and 40 copies for religious and philosophical works. With this in mind, some examples. The editor of the Vita Ambrosi mentions 72 manuscripts. The Vita Pelagiae has 142 manuscripts. The Life of Monks by Jerome have between 250 manuscripts up to 400. And the editor of the Historia Monacorum, very important for us, gives a list of 372 manuscripts. And, to end, the Latin translations of the text of Chrysostomus, among which the De Reparatio Lapsi, of which we have only a provisional edition, are present in 485 manuscripts. And even when the edition has been made in a way one can only admire, the editor mentioned very complex textual traditions where the Visigothic group, as some say, is sometimes clearly separate from the others, but not always, and sometimes has more questions than it solves. For example, for the Vita Pelagiae, no stemma would be built. The tradition is too complex. For the Indiculum Librorum, a list of works appended by Posidius to the Vita Augustini, the editor says that the Visigothic group is strange, is apart from the rest, but he's not able, for the time being, to say if the French group is better because it was earlier, or if the Spanish has derived from a Spanish branch, as North Africa is closer to Spain. So, if we our conclusions, if we reach them one day, can revert the problems in many cases. For the Historia Monacorum, you can see here that we have a quite complex stemma, with where we can see that the family Eta, which we have here, is quite contaminated. It's our family. And if we compare it to the stemma of the Vita Antoni, so we see here that our Spanish family is in the middle of something, while for the Vita Antoni, the group is here, clearly separate from the others, but not contaminated. But if they circulated together, they should be both in the same position in the apparatus, or in positions similar. Those last two texts, together with the Lives of the Monks by Jerome, are crucial for the creation of the compilation, because as Pascal Bertrand, the editor of the Vita Antoni, showed in his edition, it seems that there existed, before Valerius, ascetic compilations that grouped together those texts. So, did Valerius have such an ascetic compilation, or did he build something on his own? While we are undone, we cannot know. So, we have now a list of difficulties, of obstacula, as Valerius would say, and in order to solve the problem, and I won't bring any results, I just put the problems, put the methods, and I will end there. It's necessary to set up protocols to check everything as much as possible, and to have at the same time a precise view of all the details and a bird's eye view of whether their combination draws a coherent picture. So, to achieve this goal, I have used and set up different things. First, I drew up a list of texts within the compilation with their position in every manuscript, and I kept in this table only the texts present in all the manuscripts, which are 4: Vita Fructuosi, Doctrina Duodecim Mandatorum, Vita Antiochi, and Vita Germani. And from this table, I have tried to make a correspondence analysis of these texts, which gives a first picture. So it may not be clear right now, but the isolation of Salamanca is very interesting to me because it bears a lot of single variants. The isolation of the second one, Real Academia de la Historia 10, is also very interesting to me because it is a compilation made by a monk of, if I remember well, Silos, but I may be mistaken. But it is a compilation made from another of our manuscripts, which he took and modified to make his compilation, adding his text within. So we have a compilation within the compilation. So we have here just a first picture, and well, I won't give details, but we also have coherent groups which are interesting to us. So I also selected the texts I could use to classify the manuscripts by removing the text present in less than 3 manuscripts. Then, as I mentioned it about the life of Antony, I started collating the text on the manuscripts with a table, because this format seems to be at the same time the easiest form to read and the easiest form to take advantage of for further processing. I used as a basis the text of the most recent or most reliable critical edition, but as philologists know, collation is a difficult work where the occasions of mistake are permanent. One of these occasions, as we know, is the permanent jump of the eye between his reference and the manuscript he collates. So this problem had been solved by some scribes and some Benedictine monks in the 17th century by the use of dictation. I don't have fellow monks or colleagues I could use for this purpose. My daughter didn't want to do it, so I decided to work in collaboration with my computer, and more precisely with a free text-to-speech software called eSpeak, that transforms a written text in a read-aloud text. And so we will, in 10 seconds, collate together the text which is here.
Please stop it, capiti mero aqua, et oculis meis fontem lacrimacum, opportunius multorum amerquam tunc a prophetaticeretur.
And we have here clearly the difference, because there is no dei in the text, and there is no diceretur, there is dicetur in our manuscripts. As you can see, it's not very pleasant to hear, but it accelerates considerably the task of collation to the extent that we can pass very quickly on the low key that causes absolutely no problem and spend as much time as we want on difficult elements. I said this presentation would be a little bit frustrating. It is. As far as the compilation is concerned, I will stop here after a short explanation of the work to come. As you have understood, I want to have a collation of all my manuscripts to see, among other things, if there is a coherence between the internal structure of texts and the version of the text they bear. My aim in doing so under a tabular form is to have stuff I can easily describe globally and in details, transform with scripts, and analyze with existing tools, because people interested in automated thematology have made several interesting suggestions of algorithms in the last few years, or building mine if necessary, in order to try, finally, to be able to see clearly what happened to those texts in Iberian Peninsula, and above all, and really above all, in my opinion, to give people that would like to check my own work to be able to do so, or to build something on it, and to give them so easy means to do so. And so I jump on the appendix I had planned because I have no time, just for the thanks. After all that English, finally some words in Polish. Dziękuję bardzo.
For this fascinating paper, and now there will be a round of questions and comments. Who would like to begin? which you wish. Italian, Spanish, French, English, Polish, if you wish, then you can translate it.
It looks like an immense work. That's what we plan to do. That's my comment. Maybe I didn't understand well, and I would like to get some more precise information. How much manuscripts do you plan to collect? And in what extension?
This is the tricky part. In which language shall I answer?
Before the 3 o'clock.
D'accord.
3 minutes.
Non, dans quelle langue?
En quelle langue?
En anglais. The point is that the only way of having an accurate picture is to collate all the text of all the manuscripts. Because the issue I will face if I don't do it, and the issue I will face because I won't do it, is that there won't be, there may be no coherence between my practice and the practice of the previous editors. But I will try to solve it in another way, which is that I will collate all my manuscripts, that is to say, all the manuscripts that are officially linked to the compilations today, and those who are at the border, and I can give you more details if you want. And I will, I think, try to ask the programs I will build to check, to take only into account the lines where I intervened. Because this is the only way I have to interpret the differences as meaningful. And maybe I will have to, well, where the textual tradition is not that huge, I may also check the manuscripts concerned. For example, there is one that does not, for the time being, belongs to the compilation, and which is a problem to me. It's this one that has been considered by Pascal Bertrand as belonging to what he called the Visigothic group, but which has been copied in France, in southern France, in the 11th century. And so we have the eternal problem, that is, does this closeness come from the same model that who afterwards passed to Spain during the Visigothic kingdom, in which southern France and Spain were the same kingdom? So do we have 3 witnesses of the same ancestor but with different steps? Or do we have, and did we ignore it because of our scientific blindness, testimony of the circulation of the hagiographical compilation outside Spain, where texts proper to Valerius would have been discarded because no one knew who he is, and we just wanted to make an ascetic compilation. So, for example, I think that maybe, but that's the main problem, maybe I will trust Pascal Bertrand on this and check that myself and add my manuscripts. But I know that, and actually in an ideal world, I would check everything. I can't.
So, very fundamental question, and perhaps you've already explained it and I didn't understand, but I think it's important how one could define from the structural point of view this hagiographical compilation. What are the characteristics of this? I mean, as long as genre. So, and another, is it possible to find here in this group of texts some formulaic expressions? I mean, let's compare, comparemus or something like that, or is it not the right way to try? So my question is how to establish that this text should be suspected as belonging to hagiographical compilation, and this should not be regarded as such. It's a starting point.
This is a starting point, but in my point of view, it must be the arrival point for one reason. One could think that the themes of the texts are the criterion on which we could build the coherence of the compilation. And for example, Manuel Diaz did it when he tried to reconstruct the compilation. For example, he discarded the life of Augustine because it is quite different in formulation. It's quite different in formulation. It deals with different concerns, and what's more, it bears at the end the text I talked about, the Indiculum Librorum, which is the list that Posidus added at the end of the life of Augustine. And so Manuel Diaz wrote that there were external reasons to discard it, of which I doubt a little bit, and there was also an internal reason that an ascetic compilation couldn't, without being absurd, integrate a list of books. But the point is that this is a modern point of view. And so the question of the thematic content is a crucial one, but I don't want to deal with it before I have reached the construction of more, let's say, objective picture. So this is why I said that I wanted to focus on the content of the texts, because, well, the work on the coherence of the whole has already been done by people who said that, well, it's not so, well, who reach conclusions which are always open. So I want to say, well, we'll see it later. First, I want to see, for example, if the testimony of the life of Augustine may have been added in the 10th century, because our witness is of the 10th century, or before. Am I clear?
I can say I am mostly interested on your methods. So how you do it, because as you are working on it alone, yeah, or there is a team of people?
No, there is a team of people who are working on the edition of Valerius, and this is a team of very generous people who answer the questions, who provide the books when I need them, etc., etc. But they deal with the personal text of Valerius, and I deal with the hagiographical compilation and the way both articulate. So no, on this question I work alone.
Mm-hmm.
Let's say.
So you have many manuscripts to do the collation, and
What?
And as far as I understood, you are using some automatical devices, yes?
Well, for the collation,
programs, yeah.
for the collation, it's just a way to digitize a very old method, which is, well, I want to collate. I know that it will be quicker, even with some differences, but it will be quicker, but with the ear. So, well, I do it. But what I insist on is that I want, well, for example, what I showed of the correspondence analysis, or what I didn't show because it's not ready yet, of the computation of the distances between manuscripts. What I want to do is to take my manuscripts. So what, as I answered to Anya, my 10 manuscripts, no more, because I have 80 texts. So if I take 80 texts and all the manuscripts, so that won't be possible. But I try to, as much as possible, take those texts and to have an as comprehensive as possible collation, tabular collation, and then I will see if with all those data I can draw a picture.
But you, so you will draw this picture with all those data. Do you have some idea of doing it automatically also, or just it will be a database and you will do it manually?
No. It won't be. I will try to do it as automatically as possible. Well, I didn't insist on it because, as you saw, I just had the time to present what I did. But and moreover, it's not ready. But I've been having a close look to what is being done on automated stematology. For example, the works of Jean-Baptiste Camps. Or of Philippe Rely, and also their great ancestors, for example, Jacques Froger, who worked on those questions in the end of the 60s. And I think that what I would like to do, if I have the time, is to use my data to benchmark their methods, because once more, I like to do it myself in order to be able to see the whole processing and to be able to say, well, here it produces something weird, I will see. But this work has been done, some work has been done on algorithms that work quite well, so I would like to try them. But the funny thing is that, as Philippe Rely wrote in an article where he gave the first version of his collation method, he said that when you try to compare to the text of 2 or 3 or more manuscripts, there is one method that produces 95% of success, which is only the computation of the distance between words, and so the addition of the computation of the distance, and the 5, which is a method which is the simplest ever. You take 2 words and you see how much operations you have to do to transform one in the other. Well, here we have some problems, for example, with our Sancti et Schio, which one is the right distance? Do we consider Sancti as SCI, and this is distance of 1 or 3? Well, these are open questions, but the 5% that remain to go as close as possible to very satisfying results imply to use very complex methods, and this is where I differ. That is, if I want to be the master of my interpretation, maybe I will stick to those 90%. But if I want to see how methods developed by others, notably on phylogeny, etc., or a method that had been used to, and I should have mentioned it by Alain Guéraud in the 90s to compare exempla of the Cister. I will try. So there will be my method that won't go as far as theirs, but I will control everything, and their methods to see if the results are different, the results suggest me new tracks, etc., etc. That's open.
I think that we have time to discuss in more detail during lunch. So, are there any other questions for now? I think that if I may comment on the comment of that is, I think that what lacks is the base work of showing the people how you can do those things. So I mean to show what are the input data, what are the output data, and what does happen to those data during the process. So, but I think that this kind of work might be made during some kind of workshop that we could maybe organize together to doing those two communities between the people like Renaud and those who are curious about how to implement the precise workflow. Because this is how I do understand your question, as more fundamental one. What do I do if I have some some information about the textual variability, and then what do I do to cluster those data? Where do I click exactly to have those data that you present? This is still another argument for publishing also the workflows. The thing that you have done, or those scripts that you have written, they should be also made public. So the authors might also make use of them.
So just an answer to the comment. There are softwares that already exist. As you know, I'm quite obsessed by controlling the process. So I wrote actually scripts, personal scripts, but I think that this is important actually to say that things already exist and are already available for people who would like to give their tabular data and see what comes out. And I will be actually glad to explain on my personal side what I did and what I want to do.
That's a great idea, and this is also the site of Renaud, and first and foremost his page in the repository. This is where did you put where did he upload, for example, his excellent leads paper from the last year, to which I would like to send you back, because now we do not have time to talk more about those results. Once again, thank you very much. Merci beaucoup de venir à Cracovie et ces voix, j'espère. Merci.
Merci de votre accueil et de votre attention.